Welcome back to the Muzzle Blast Podcast, the official podcast of the National Muzzleloading Rifle Association. This week we're talking to Daniel Howell. He runs the Folk Craft Revival podcast. It's been interesting following everything that Daniel's been doing. He's out in Utah, and it's been really cool to see how different the traditional or folk crafts are between where I'm at east of the Mississippi and where he's at really far out west. We get into a conversation about how American history is different between here and there and how that changes and affects the traditional craft areas of both the east and the western United States. So we go down some rabbit holes, and we talk quite a bit about how muzzleloading connects into that. If you're interested at all into working with your hands or making things, living traditionally, be sure to check out this episode. And at the end, be sure to check out the Folk Craft Revival podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, and follow him on social media to make sure that you're seeing what he's doing and how he's sharing these things. I'm looking at his site now, and he's got a lot on traditional archery. He's getting interested in traditional foraging. So if you're into kind of the living historically side of things, but also you've got a little interest in muzzleloaders, be sure to check out this show and check out his show as well. Thank you.
Well, I grew up in a lot of small towns. We lived in Eastern Oregon for a while in a town of about 400. And then we moved to Utah, and we were in, smaller town, central Utah, a couple thousand people. Grew up in a lot of small towns, and, we were always involved in a lot of, growing your own food and whatnot. But then my dad had a couple of books that really got us going on a lot of different things. We had Larry Dean Olson's Outdoor Survival Skills and Tom Brown Jr.'s Wilderness Survival Skills, I think it's called.
Okay, yeah.
So I started in the kind of the survival area, the wilderness survival and outdoor skills, woodsmanship type things. Doing things like friction fire and canning buckskin and edible plants, things like that. So,
oh, cool.
That's kind of where I started. I've always been fascinated with making things with my hands and whatnot. So, eventually I, started reading other books and got into things like bow making. The library had a copy of, I think it was The Bowyer's Craft by Jay Massey.
Okay.
And I read that one and then ended up ordering copies of the traditional Bowyer's Bible, the first couple books there that they had out at that point. They didn't have the later ones, but got into things like bow building, started making my own knives, a bunch of things like that. And yeah, just steadily progressed. I've always enjoyed reading, so I'm always finding random how-to books in the library and reading them and then trying to replicate what I'm reading about.
Yeah.
So, been a lot of fun.
That's awesome. And is this part of your day job then, or do you work somewhere else?
So I'm a woodworker.
Okay, awesome.
I did professional woodworking for a couple of years. With a larger wood shop. We were mainly doing custom wood doors, sending them to some of the nicer areas, up to Jackson, Wyoming and Park City. Okay. So some really, really nice high-end custom doors. Did that for a couple of years, and then I started my own side business. That's what I've been doing for the last 2 years. I've been making custom wood and antler rings.
Oh, cool.
So a lot of men's wedding bands,
yeah,
that type of thing.
I looked at wood, but I wasn't sure how long it was going to last. I got married in November, and I was kind of nervous about, about it splitting and things, but that's really cool.
Yeah, I haven't had any issues with that so far. Like I said, I've been doing it for a couple of years, and I have too many rings at this point because when I come up with a new idea or design or whatever, I make it in my size and try it out before I make it for anyone else. So I've got a bunch of them, which might be, it's fun, and I enjoy them. They're a lot lighter weight. I prefer the feel to metal, and I really like the look.
Yeah, I bet it's a lot more natural feeling.
Yes and no. You end up putting a finish over it anyways. But it doesn't have that like cold metal feel. Yeah. And they're a lot lighter weight. They're a lot of fun, and I like making things that are pretty and detailed and whatever. So
yeah, it's nice to get out and work with your hands. I was stitching up some sheaths for some knives that we make last night while we're watching TV. It's just kind of nice to, I was still working and I should have been kind of relaxing, I guess, but it was just nice to, at the end of the night, be able to sit down and look at those and say, hey, I made those.
That's kind of why I have a hard time with jobs that I can't see the result of.
Yeah.
I really like working on something where I see a direct result of what I've been doing, and I haven't just been sitting on a computer or pushing paper all day. So I like seeing a product, something I created. I guess I'm just a creator. I like seeing what I created at the end of the day or end of the week or whatever.
Yeah.
So
just a lot of our members are aging, they're kind of in their mid 60s and really concerned about young people getting into, muzzleloading isn't your focus, but a lot of what we do is traditional craft education and American history education. And that, you can't separate the history from the craftsman is how I look at things. Whether you're building bows or rings or pouches or guns, it's all connected. And so I just like to sit down and kind of talk. It's really nice being able to do this and sit down and talk with people about that kind of stuff. So if there's anything that you specifically want to talk about or want to bring up, go ahead. Like I said, I try to take it pretty casual.
And feel free to take you down a rabbit hole, a side tangent somewhere, huh?
Yeah, exactly. We interviewed, we were at a show this weekend, the Connor Long Rifle Show here in Indiana. It's a small living history kind of trade fair deal, but we sat down with a couple event coordinators and vendors there, and we went down some rabbit holes where I looked at the recording and it was like 2 hours long. But it was a lot of fun being able to sit down and talk with people about that, because out where we're at, we go to a lot of shows and meet with a lot of people, but it's really rare to be able to sit down and have a full 2 hour conversation with somebody, and this is a great excuse to sit down and do that.
That's what I found with my podcast too. It's it's a great excuse to just reach out to people you've never met before and talk about something which you've never really been exposed to.
Yeah.
And I've loved that part, is I've been able to connect with a bunch of people that honestly I would have never had an excuse to talk with otherwise. And then just the conversations you get and some of the information you learn, and I don't know, it's just a ton of fun chatting with people. So completely understand there. And I don't know that I have many rabbit holes in mind, but I'm sure something will come up while we're chatting. So
yeah.
I've always been kind of interested in muzzle loaders. But honestly, I've never had the, time and money, I suppose,
right,
to get involved in another hobby.
Yeah.
So to me, listening to your podcast, I've followed you guys on Instagram now for a little while. I don't spend much time on social media, but I've always been fascinated with the history, kind of like you're talking about, and I really enjoyed your guys' first episode. I have listened to your episodes, your podcast episodes. So I really enjoyed your first episode where you guys were talking about the history and the craft and muzzleloading in general and some of the past of the organization or whatever. I think it would be fun to be involved with that. I just need to find the time and money to get involved in yet another hobby. Yeah. So.
There's always a million things pulling.
You were talking about just one of the fairs you were just at. Are there quite a few of these living history events that you go to? Are there quite a few of them back east?
Yeah. So, and that's what I'm finding is as I continue, I mean, we're very active east of the Mississippi, and we have quite a few of our charter clubs and field representatives west of the Mississippi. And we're looking at trying to get back west as an organization. But what I'm finding is we have a lot of living history and trade fair type events, whereas out west, they're more referred to as rendezvous, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so for out east here, I mean, when it really starts, the probably the first or second week of January after the holidays.
Oh, wow.
They start up, and, we have a lot of our volunteers and board members and a lot of the people that set up at our events are on the road, 30, 35 weekends out of the year going to different events. So, I mean, the Connor Long Rifle Show is one of the first around this area for the year. There's one down in the very southern end of Indiana that starts the week before. And then there's pretty much one, as the weather warms up it's, all of them are inside right now. But come probably March and April, they'll start being outside, as things warm up. And then it just kind of starts to run. And, if you have the gas money and the vehicle and the gear, you can be out just about, I think, every weekend until about mid-November.
Oh, that's awesome. I may have to look into, do you guys have a list or anything like that on your website of events that go on over the year?
Yeah, we've got an event calendar on our website that's set up with our events and, just general events that we found online hosted there with as much information as we can find on them. So they're linked with an address and the event website, the contact information for the people that host the event. And that's all in there on the calendar. And you can look at it kind of by calendar. You can look at it by state or by event type. So if you're looking for kind of a trade fair like this one was, you can search for that and find that.
I may have to look into that in the future. I would love to get back to some more things. And I think you're right. Muzzle loading out here, I don't think is as big, mainly because we don't have the history as much as you guys do east of the Mississippi.
Right. You guys get a lot into the kind of the mountain men and the fur trade out there.
So you get the mountain man fur trade, a little bit of history out here. And yeah, you do have people very interested in that. And I've read a number of like the old trapper journals and whatnot. That's always fascinated me. So yeah, you get some muzzle loading type rifles that were used then, but really the westward expansion by that point, I mean, a lot of it post-Civil War, you start getting into like breech loading rifles and you get like lever action Winchesters and Colt revolvers. And
yeah, it's not too fast.
Like that. So that's much more of a part of our history out west than it is east. And you guys have more of a history with the muzzle loading and a couple centuries of that type of thing back there.
Yeah, that's one of the big things around here. Pennsylvania is one of the largest active states for us, just and as you go east, you get to the coast where things are a lot more built in, but you have that history of the French and Indian War and the obviously the American Revolution, and then even up into 1812 for the War of 1812. I mean, we have several battleground sites here in Indiana that we have evidence. There have been digs. We know that these battles came kind of pre-percussion, pre-1840 era, which is really neat for us because we can go out to these sites and hold these real artifacts. The Tippecanoe County Historical Association here in Indiana and has a whole battleground museum on the battleground with a battleground memorial of that, and they have artifacts that were dug up there, and
wow.
So for us out here, I mean, it's flintlocks are big for us.
That's a lot more real. That's a lot more tangible history. That's kind of an abstract part of history for us out here because it's
right.
Wasn't
you guys
really
got
around
there
at all.
Yeah. But at the NMLRA, we do a lot of. I mean, for us, it's all muzzleloaders. So we focus. I mean, anything that loads from the muzzle, we're a big fan of. So if you're even like the wheel or matchlocks, you're more than welcome to shoot those. Flintlocks, percussion. We've recently expanded actually into a lot of black powder cartridge because a lot of our guys are really interested in the history side of things, and they get started in traditional muzzleloaders and then kind of advance through time a little bit up into the black powder cartridge or the sharps. And in late March, we're working with a group in Tennessee to host the Creedmoor 150. I believe kind of 1840s, 1860s, with the Creedmoor rifles shooting out to 1,000 yards with muzzleloaders and breech loaders, which is kind of exciting. And so
pretty impressive.
Yeah, and people don't. A lot of people assume that muzzleloaders are only good, out to 100 yards, off of a rest. But we have a large chunk of our membership loves pushing that limit. And I kind of call them race guns because it's a lot like a race car where you're constantly trying to push that limit. And there's a lot of people trying to push that limit with historic guns, working on the loads and the charges and things, which gets really interesting. So, I mean, everybody has the thing that they think of when they think of muzzleloaders, but whatever you like, I would argue there's a muzzleloader for you.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's kind of like knives. I mean, you can get a knife in any different style, any different material, any different handle, all sorts of different things. You can customize it and truly get whatever you want. So I imagine muzzleloaders are kind of the same, but you have actually probably more variety because you've had technological advances throughout the time period they were being used.
Yeah. There's a lot of variation. If you're just looking for a hunting rifle, you know, you can stay pretty basic, but you get up into the kind of the competition race guns, it gets really interesting.
Yeah. You are right with the events out here being mainly called rendezvous, though. I mean, I went to the Jim Bridger rendezvous over in Wyoming quite a bit when I was younger. My dad would take the family. And we had a ton of fun out there, but I kind of quit going to the rendezvous because I felt like, you know, when we were younger, you had a lot of people that were actually kind of living it. You still had some actual fur trappers that would come in, and a lot of people that were a lot more into the history and things. And then I felt like it kind of devolved into more of like a craft fair selling stuff. You still have the furs and the, you know, black powder match, you know, and things like that. And it just turned a lot more products being sold though than it used to be when I was a kid. So I kind of moved away from going to those, but it's definitely a fascinating event and fascinating things going on still.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, we're seeing a lot of that. It's, I don't know, a good way to describe it, but I think, what we talk about sometimes is there's a difference between living history and trying to replicate history accurately in an educational manner, and then the history of living history. So for the NMLRA, we saw a huge boost in the 70s, you know, with the 200th anniversary.
Yeah.
And looking at the photographs and things, at that time period, events even out east here were called rendezvous, because it wasn't necessarily about the historic accuracy, or that's just what we knew from the time period. And so now you have the kind of a split in the community if you're living history or if you're living history, you know, is the kit and the gear that you have accurate, or is it accurate to what you grew up with, you know, and we're not trying to police anything like that. A lot of, you know, there are events that control that very strictly. And I think that's just kind of the growing pains of figuring out what we're all doing.
Yeah, just kind of interesting though to see what's going on and watch it evolve.
Yeah, because a big area for events out here is the craft and the traditional, you know, working with your hands side of things. So a lot of our events will have massive school days where they try to bring in elementary schools from, you know, 2 hours away to come see and interact with the living historians and with the craftspeople. And they'll put on kind of a battle reenactment, you know, it's kind of entertainment on things to give them an idea of history outside of the textbook. Because now, and it's something that we see a lot at those events, is that kids don't really have a concept of somebody making something. You know, they order it, they see it in the store, and they don't see that human connection to it. And even now, you know, even electronics, and they're still put together by people, but even down to like a chair or a rolling pin, a spoon, a cup, a bag, they don't equate that human connection to it. And when they do see it, I think the troubling part for me is that they see it as bad, that person has to work and make something, which it's, you know, I'm not trying to, you know, sit down and be a grandpa about it, you know, about the kids these days, you know, but I think it's something that people that are interested in making stuff with their hands and interested in history and how things were done in the past, I think it's something to pay attention to.
That definitely is. Yeah. It's, it is kind of sad. If we're going to try and avoid being grandpas here, but it is kind of sad, how it's become so, just, it's something you can't, or something they can't relate to. And
yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Something has to get made, and someone spent, you know, 6 hours or whatever on this particular thing, and that's just something they can't relate to at all. And that is kind of sad, because all products, well, everything, you know, whether it be the food you eat or the clothes you're wearing or whatever, it's someone put time into it. So
yeah, I love that. I love how you put that relating to it, because it's not the child's fault that they don't understand or they're not interested in it. They've never been exposed to anything like that. And it's not necessarily even the parents' fault. It's just a change in culture. And to keep all this stuff going, I mean, on our website, the first thing that comes up is preserving history. And that's what it's about. It's making sure that we're cataloging and saving this information for when that kid, is 13 or 14 and starts developing their own interests, and they start being interested in this kind of thing, and exposing kids to living history and traditional craft and muzzleloading and working with your hands. I think that's something that as humans we're really connected to, and it's really important to share that as much as we can. And I think that's where, the Folk Craft Revival podcast and the NMLRA and Muzzle Blasts and all the people that we both talk to, I think that's where it's another step in that outreach to make sure that this stuff is ready and the history is there for these children when they start developing those interests.
That really is. For me, it was a lot about, I want to help other people learn, but it's a lot about kind of preserving some of the old crafts. I mean, there's a lot of crafts that, frankly, no one knows how to do anymore. You can find things in museums and people are like, oh, well, this was in someone's barn somewhere and we have no idea what it does or how it works or what it was for.
Right. We can just kind of guess on it.
We can guess on it. And that's kind of sad because you're like, that's only 150 years old. Like, yeah, that's fairly modern machinery. Late 1800s, and we don't know what it was for. That's forgetting pretty rapidly, but a lot of my podcast too. That's what I've enjoyed, is talking with craftsmen and people who know how to do things. And I've started out attempting to keep it more of like a how-to type podcast, so people could really learn how something was done and the principles behind something.
Yeah.
But as I've progressed, I've realized that a lot of that's fun, and I'm going to keep doing that. But there's a lot of interesting stories that people have to tell as to how they became a craftsman and some of their thoughts on working with your hands and developing a skill or a trade or a craft, whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of interesting stories and thoughts that people have on how this develops and how it impacts them and the people around them and whatnot. So I've kind of not necessarily drifted away from being more of a how-to based. There's still that base in a lot of the episodes, but definitely explore a lot of the stories that people have as well.
And I think those stories are as important as the how-to, because the stories are how we relate to that person. It's hard to look at what somebody is doing or the craft that they're doing, and it could just be totally unrelatable. But if you sit down and talk with them and you hear that backstory of how they got into it and what they were like when they were younger, looking and seeking this knowledge, you can find that relationship, and then you can see the path that they took. And even if you're not taking that same path, maybe it takes you down a road to connect with something else. I mean,
it humanizes it and brings it a little more into the present for you.
Yeah. I mean, we have in the traditional craft community that we see, there are leather workers, and there's kind of the staple toolkit really for shooting a muzzleloader. And if you're shooting traditionally or modern, it's pretty much the same thing. But there's the muzzleloader itself. There's the powder container that you're using, and then you usually have a box or a bag to carry, supplies and tools that go with it. And then within that community, you have people making, those tools in a million different sections. I mean, there are people that get down to specific counties with their muzzleloader, that I'm building, a Boone County or Lancaster County from this area, from this time period rifle, and I'm pairing it with this bag from this area in this time period. And then traditionally you're using a horn to store your powder with your powder horn. And then you get into, the same things with those, but then you can also get into replicating the personal history of an original horn. So the original powder horns were oftentimes kind of a personal history of who carried it. And they had information on there about them or their family or what they had lived through. And then, you're getting into another section there where you can kind of go down that rabbit hole of where that person came from. And you can be really connected to that, which is really
that's
exciting.
Fascinating. I never really think about history as being, well, yes, history is county specific, but things like craft, I never think of them as being county specific. I think more regionally. So it's fascinating to hear that there really are differences from county to county and a lot of the things you guys work with, because I would have looked at it and been like, yeah, I'm building something that was common in New England or Massachusetts or something like that. I wouldn't have even thought to go county specific.
Right.
At that point, I would have just assumed that the differences were, differences between craftsmen.
Right. And that's what's, at least where we're at out east here is, you're in a pre-industrial era for the United States. So you had things that were produced in styles, like the Windsor chair is a Windsor chair is a Windsor chair. I mean, and don't get me started on that. There's a lot of different areas within that, and that. But I think, especially as you get out west, I mean, everybody thinks of the Hawken rifles, and then that you started to get into that industrial era for the United States, where you could produce things not in mass like we think of now, but it was a lot different than a gun builder in the hills of Tennessee, making a couple guns a year in their style.
Where they're all different.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're right. That definitely changes things. I mean, even thinking, crossing the plains and whatever, we think Conestoga wagons. Before you had a couple large companies just building the same style wagon, I imagine there were hundreds of different wagon styles all over the place, depending on your needs.
Yeah. And they were connected to those families and, where they came from. And I imagine that the Nordic wagons, were different than the European wagons.
Yeah.
And you kind of get into all that, and that's really interesting.
Very, very fascinating. I'm always drawn into things like that and exploring the differences between different crafts and the areas they come from and what their uses were. It's fascinating to see how people will alter a craft or a trait or whatever based on the specific circumstances or needs in their area.
Yeah. So you've been out, is it Utah? Is that correct?
I'm in Utah right now. Okay. Yes.
And where did you grow up then? You've been west of the Mississippi your whole life.
I've been west of the Mississippi my whole life. Living. I've visited east, but living. I've lived west. I've lived in. I was born in Montana. I've lived in Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, Oregon, and as an adult, I lived in Alaska for a summer. So.
Oh wow.
We bounced around quite a bit. I've lived in a good portion of the Rocky Mountain states.
Yeah. That's really neat. As I'm the exact opposite. I've lived out east and I've traveled out west. But I think what you said about the differences in the history is really neat, because that aligns with what we see online. And I think where, a lot of times there's a dichotomy of east and west when it comes to history. And history lovers, because you like one or the other typically.
Yeah.
But they're all connected, and we talk a lot about in the association here that the history of muzzleloading is American history. I mean, they were important to us, in becoming a country and then continuing to be a country. And
we really were formed by them. Yes.
Yeah. And we joke that the long rifle is the first true American art form, because we brought in influences from England and Germany, but then we made it fit what we were doing here, and then it just kind of expanded on that. And especially as you go west, that shapes just firearms history and the history of everything, at least for this country, I think.
I definitely agree. It is interesting. I've never really thought about muzzleloading in those terms. But you're right, it is more of an American history. Yes, Europe had firearms and everything, but if you really think about it, England was built on the backs of longbows, not firearms.
Yeah.
England was around for a long time before firearms were developed. Things like Germany, Spain, things like that, they were developed or became countries long before firearms were developed. So it is kind of interesting how, we are much more formed by and had a much bigger role in our history than it did on some of the European countries.
Your show is focused and your life is focused around traditional craft. And you mentioned, working and building nice doors. But where's that taking you now? I mean, do you have a personal workshop that you work out of? You're producing these rings? Are you still building some furniture? Working on a house? What's kind of the timeline look like for your traditional craft? And how did you start to get interested in muzzleloading?
For me, muzzleloading. For me, it's simply about being fascinated with our past. I've always been fascinated with our past, whether that be Bronze Age something or whether that be, muzzleloading in the 1800s. So I've always been just fascinated with the past and how things were done and how things relate to each other and how I can learn from them, figuring out how things were built. As a craftsman, I just work out of my garage. So I have a garage. I have a little workshop set up in, and at the moment that's been working for me. Going forward, I'm not exactly sure what we're going to be doing. We would like to move here in the near-ish future. So we're in a townhome right now, and it's kind of a struggle for me because I grew up in smaller towns, just being able to disappear to the mountains and having wide open spaces and yards and things like that. And a lot of the projects I'm involved in, I mean, I still tan hides and whatever in our back patio, which is essentially what our backyard is in a townhome. But we're looking to move, and at that point, it's kind of up in there. It'll depend on where we move and what the area looks like and whatever. But for me, a lot of the craft going forward, or a lot of the traditional skills going forward, I think this summer I'm not necessarily going to be focused on learning a new craft per se, but a skill. I've kind of dabbled in foraging my entire life, and last summer I got into it a little more heavily. But just seeking that connection a little more with my food. And I guess I'm a person that craves simplicity. I like seeing the direct result of, my hands are cold, I make a pair of mittens. I'm hungry, I go pick up some food or whatever from the garden. So for me, that's kind of where I'm at. Is I like the simplicity of providing for myself. So I'm going to be focusing a lot on foraging this year, and I got my degrees. I got a degree in wildlife biology and then one in rangeland resources. So I already know a lot of the plants around here. It's just then pairing it with learning more of what's edible and how to prepare them so they taste good. I think that's probably going to be going forward one of my big things I'm focused on learning.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. And it's very much tied in with, very connected to traditional craft and American history. Because that's, when you think about it, it's not too far away, in the timeline from where we're at now.
Oh yeah. When everyone was, you're paying attention to what food was available. And, I like I said, I'm out west, so I relate more to the stuff out west, but you had pioneers moving in, and you learned to dig camas bulbs or something like that, because that's what the natives did in the area, and that's a massive food resource that honestly tastes great. So it's just one we've kind of forgotten about these days. But 100 years ago, that was a major, very important part of living, living in general. So
we joke that when we go on the road to go cover a show or even set up at our home range, that we have so much stuff, and when I load up the car with all the equipment, it's just kind of crazy to think that people were going out, with what they could carry and living for months on end, just trekking and long hunting and trapping. And it's kind of bizarre to think about now. I mean, before I go anywhere, I've got a bag full of stuff, that you might never need, but it's the stuff I want to have with me. And
the just in case.
Yeah, it's the just in case stuff. And not 150 years ago, that was, people just found what they needed where they were at.
Or you just did without.
Yeah, or just did without. Yeah, you didn't need so much.
That's kind of an interesting conversation. I had a similar one with my dad not long ago. I was reading a book, and they were talking about, blanket rolls and just rolling up in one blanket out into the fire and whatever. And I was talking with my dad about, I kind of wonder what the difference is. Have we just become so used to being comfortable all the time that we can't do that? Or have we lost is there some secret art and skill to staying warm, rolled up in one thin blanket next to the fire? Because I don't think I would sleep very well for very long doing that.
Right, yeah. And
I don't know if it's just we've gotten so used to being comfortable, or if that's like a missing link somewhere in our knowledge between there and now, where we've just forgotten how things need to be done in order to make it a little more functional.
Yeah, that was something interesting talking with Eli Froge and Jason Jacobs in our I think it was our second episode, but we talked about that some, where it's going out and doing what they're doing, which is kind of historically accurate trekking, is they're going out with equipment and gear and food that, of a certain time period, and they're going out and surviving, and they'll do winter squirrel hunts where they'll go out in the woods and winter camp and set up and do things. But they kind of described it as being intentionally uncomfortable, is going out and trying to do what our forefathers did. And I think that was a really interesting point there that kind of goes along with what you're saying. Is it something that, they just did, and it was just what they did, and it wasn't about being comfortable. It's just all they could do. They only had one blanket. Yeah, it was just life. And now we get in our air-conditioned house, we go to our air-conditioned car to go to an air-conditioned store and, eat ready-served food. And, it's just a difference in life maybe. But it's something that's interesting that, people think that everybody's ignoring or forgetting about that history. But I think there's a lot of people still going out and trying to find it.
I actually followed his... I follow him as well online, and I loved seeing his pictures of his dugout journey when he was out on his dugout canoe and whatever. I follow one other guy who does dugout stuff as well. He just floated the Mississippi River. He started in Montana, went down the Missouri, and then down the Mississippi.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah, it was great fun seeing the pictures and whatnot. But it's. I think too that's kind of what drew me to survival and the wilderness survival type stuff growing up. Similar sort of thing. It's not that you're not life-threateningly uncomfortable, but you go out and you build a shelter and you stay in it for a night or two, and you can make yourself more comfortable, but a lot of times you're just dealing with low levels of uncomfortableness because it's not what you're used to.
Yeah.
And I don't think it would be a problem if you were used to it, if that was your day-to-day sleeping arrangement. But the simple fact that we're used to soft mattresses and whatever, you're just dealing with low levels of uncomfortability when you start some of these things.
Yeah. And I think that's what's interesting for us seeing, I'm sure you see the same thing, but the bushcraft community is doing that, but in kind of a modern sense. They're using modern equipment and modern tools, but we're seeing a lot of those people get interested in muzzleloading because, they're not necessarily interested in firearms, but it's another not easy thing. It's something that takes some knowledge and takes some research and takes some tinkering, because that's the fun thing about a muzzleloader is, you can really tune something in, but it's not put a magazine and go. Which has always been kind of what's dissuaded me from modern rifles. It just seemed too simple. Yeah. And I don't have to learn anything. Yeah. And I would argue, which I know is probably simplifying it down for those folks who shoot modern rifles. Right. But from an outsider perspective, yeah. I would argue that if you get into muzzleloading and start researching and start understanding, it's a lot simpler than modern firearms, because you can take a couple bolts out, open up your lock and tune the spring, tune your triggers, file a little thing down here and there, and put it all back together with a couple tools. And that's the other part that would be another big draw for me into muzzleloading is
I like being able to work on my stuff or with my stuff.
Yes.
I like being able to make my own. Well, that's why I use longbows. I mean, I grew up with recurves, and that was part of what got me into it. But that's why I got into making my own longbows and doing a little bit of hunting with my bows and whatnot, is because I like being in control and knowing that I can make my weapon. I can fix my weapon if anything goes wrong. I know what I'm doing and what's going on with it and how I can alter it if I want to or anything like that. And so a muzzleloader, to me, it's not to the point where I feel intimidated by it. I mean, I could open it up and I could logically look at it and be like, okay, so this does this, which then causes that to do that. And I could logically figure it out if I needed to.
Yeah.
Which is kind of like vehicles. I mean, if I look at a 1970s vehicle, there's so much less in it, and you can logically go through and be like, well, okay, this part seems to be working all right, and that part seems to be working all right. You get into modern vehicles, and it's kind of the same way. You look at it, and it's like a modern rifle, and you're like, well, I don't know. It's just there's too much going on in there, and there's electronics all of a sudden controlling things. And
yeah.
So for me, yeah, I would love to get into muzzle loading. And like I said, I've been fascinated by it for years, but I've never taken the plunge. So.
Well, I recommend
at some point I need to
anybody, and especially for somebody like yourself. If you're interested in building one, there are several kits available, to kind of get started. But boy, after you put together a kit, you're going to want to start.
It's going to be addicting.
Yeah, there's never just one, I don't think. And that's where even talking to the guys that are shooting modern muzzleloaders now, there's a lot of people building, precision, long range, out to 800 yards muzzleloaders that are very modern looking. I mean, the thing that's really popular right now is using a black or a 209 primer, a shotgun primer, or a large rifle primer as your percussion cap, like you would, on a percussion rifle or a musket. And it's inside of a bolt action assembly, and people look at it and think that it's a modern rifle, but the guts are all muzzleloader. The only difference is just that the difference in the primer and the action. And even those guys got started on the traditional side of things. And that's how they got into it, because they liked to be able to open something up, be able to investigate, and be able to tinker on it. And
I think it's one of those things too. Once you learn the simple, or the basics, the understanding, then you can progress on to some of the more difficult or technologically different aspects too.
Yes, you can start to kind of advance it, and then you find yourself going up through time, advancing, into the black powder cartridge, and then you kind of get into the modern era where you even go back to the muzzleloading aspect and try to figure out how to make a 200-year-old ignition technology shoot super far. And we've got targets like the Creedmoor event. It was a kind of an international event. It was held here for a few years and then held in England, and they still shoot those matches in England. And I mean, I just was looking online today about a modern Creedmoor match that was still shooting traditional muzzleloaders, but they're shooting out to 1,200 yards.
Holy smokes.
With a muzzleloader, and you just think, that's crazy, but they're doing it, and it's awesome.
That's super cool. I assume that's still open sights and everything?
Yes, I believe so. I mean, I think they have kind of peep sights set up on them. Yeah, but I don't know that how. And they're all different kinds of classifications. I mean, there's a lot of muzzleloading matches and things that are set up with scopes, especially for those long distances. But you always have your kind of modern class and then your traditional class where you're still using what they used. And we have, because history is cool, we have evidence, and we have those original targets from the late 1800s, and there are guys still now looking at those original targets saying, how did they do that? And trying to replicate it, sometimes with the same guns, because you were in that era where you had semi-mass production set up.
Yeah.
And it's cool. I love geeking out about it.
History. Yep. It's fascinating. You can always learn something from it.
Yeah. You just got to take the time and go out and look for it. And that's what's neat about, kind of what we're doing in the magazine, but also in the new media, and what you're doing, going out and talking to these people, is we talked about kind of history getting lost. And this is something I'm sure our listeners have heard before, but I talk about that you've got a moment in time now where you don't have to keep losing that information. You know, it's so easy to catalog, and it's so easy and affordable to save that information and save those interviews like never before, where you can go back and listen to those people talk and see them and how they act and how they moved around. I mean, when I put a camera on some of our members and some of our people, they get real camera shy, but I try to bring out just who they are and how they interact, because that's the kind of stuff that, you know, in 50 years or in 100 years, you're going to be able to look back and relate to that person because you see them as a real person. It's so easy to kind of get locked into that. You know, this is being recorded, this is being videoed, and then everybody kind of turns into a middle school educational videotape, and they lose their personality a little bit. But it's that kind of stuff that is important to capture, because then you can relate to people. That's why people love old photographs, you know, from the late 1800s where people are smiling or laughing, because so many of the times you see them as just stern, serious faces. And unconsciously that influences how we perceive those people. But they were people just like you and me.
Everyone sees these stern pictures, no one's smiling, everyone's like glaring at the camera like, geez, life was harsh, life was miserable.
Yeah.
But it was just,
they didn't know any other life.
Doing, and no, I understand though with I haven't tried doing videos, and I'm sure it's even worse when it comes to video, but sometimes when you chat with people and you're trying to record, it's like you got to take a minute to chat with them before you start the recording in order to kind of get everyone loosened up and
get it kind of back into a natural state.
Tight.
Yeah. Where you can kind of forget about the equipment. I mean, I'm 26, so I've kind of grown up with all of this stuff and pretty much have grown up with the internet. You know, so to me it's kind of second nature, but you know, I'm interviewing, you know, people in their late 80s, early 90s and trying to preserve that history, and they see it as a TV personality. That's who's worthy of being recorded, you know, somebody that's on TV, and trying to convince them that, you know, they're important too is always kind of the challenge.
And by and large, they have the more fascinating stories anyways. I had a Sunday school teacher growing up. I think she was like 96 or something like that. And she would tell us stories all the time of growing up before electricity and before cars and things like that. And you just, I mean, as a 7 or 8 year old kid or whatever it was, I mean, that doesn't really hit home. But looking back on it now, I'm like, holy smokes, I would love to chat with her more and really learn a little more about that time period and whatever, but kind of missed that opportunity. That's long past now, but
you don't realize it.
Older generation, I mean, there's a ton of history and ton of just things you can learn about life and the way it was lived back then. Talking to these people. And
now we're seeing a huge interest in the early 1920s in the cars, in the camping, because that was a period where we started to go camping and started to kind of try to reconnect with something at that time that their grandparents did just as day-to-day life. And, you know, where those people are, you know, now pretty much gone. But, you know, you're looking at a time period now where, you know, the 30s and 40s are starting to slip. And if we can work to preserve that, I mean, and you're thinking about it in 100 years from now, how great it would be to have that resource of the 1930s and 40s. I mean, we would kill to have that kind of resource for the 1800s, the 1700s, the 1600s, all going back. Because you wouldn't, I mean, don't get me wrong, the quest of trying to figure out how or why they did something the way they did is part of the fun. And I'm not using this as an excuse to take that away, but having that reference would be wonderful.
Well, no matter what you record, you're still going to have something else that needs figured out. I mean, you'll record someone talking about X, Y, or Z, and that'll lead you to, I learned about that part, but that just opened up a whole different question in my mind because I had never considered, you know, this. Yeah. And that's a secondary part of what they were talking about, and they never really covered it. So it'll open up whole new things in order to even think about.
tell us a little bit about your show. And you talked a little bit about interviewing craftspeople and how it's changed from like kind of a how-to to trying to get more of the story. But how did you get started doing the show, and kind of where is it at now, and just, I guess, tell our listeners a little bit about what you're doing.
Yeah. So I got started in the show last fall. It's something that honestly I wanted to get into more of the educational, teaching people things for years, some of these traditional skills and traditional craft. But I've never taken the plunge. It's been a passion of mine basically my entire life, but the last couple of years I've really wanted to get into more of the teaching side of things. And then when I went self-employed, when I left the wood shop I was working at, I started listening to podcasts. I had never listened to a podcast before that. And I loved the format. I loved being able to listen to stories, examples, educational stuff, what have you, while I was working. Because a lot of times working with your hands, yes, you do need to be focused. But once you know what you're doing, it doesn't require all of your focus.
You can zone out a little bit.
Yeah, you can zone out a little bit. You can listen to what's going on, and you know what you're doing enough that you can just keep doing it. And you may have to pause if you get to some critical part or whatever, but you can by and large listen to something in the background while you're working. So I really grew to love podcasts, and decided that was the format I was going to try and pursue. So for me, it's been a big learning curve. I've never been big into the technology side of things, because the traditional skills and traditional craft were always my passion, and I kind of avoided technology.
Yeah.
So learning to start a podcast and trying to set up a website and whatever, it's been a big learning curve. But I've had a ton of fun doing it, and getting to chat with people and talk about crafts and skills and whatnot. So I kind of took a break over December. I think we're 12 episodes in right now.
Okay,
so
great.
I have a couple others lined up for the next little while, but yeah, so far we've covered things like willow weaving and bark tanning and tracking, things like that. So looking forward, yeah, just a lot of the old traditional skills is what I want to really cover, really focus on. And that's really anywhere from, like I said, I'm interested in prehistoric, history, just learning how to do things, whether that be flint knapping or whether that be processing flax to make, linen cloth or something like that. I'm interested in all of it. So looking forward, yeah, it's really talking with people who have experimented and learned and know how to do things, and just having great conversations with them about it.
That's awesome.
No, that's something that I've actually learned. I've been running things over the last couple of months too, is a lot of people I want to chat to don't live in an area with a very good internet. And
yes,
they're kind of hesitant about technology and computers in general. I mean, so far I've talked with a lot of younger folks too, folks that are getting back into the traditional skills and whatever, because I really view that as being something that's more on the rise than it used to be. I don't know if that's just my perception or if it really is happening, but I view a lot more people as trying to get back into the traditional skills, things like bushcraft and spoon carving and foraging and things like that. There's a couple big ones, blacksmithing, things like that. There's a few big ones that people are always like the gateway into traditional skills, but I view a lot more people as coming back into it, and it's kind of interesting. I don't know if that's simply because you start seeing or viewing more things with the internet around these days, or if it's just that we crave a little bit more of a hands-on connection with the world around us now that everything's gone so digital and you don't really have that in your day-to-day living anymore. But
I think it's a good mixture of those, but also I think that the generation now that you're starting to see get interested in this stuff is they're at an age now where they have time and expendable income. Whereas, a lot of people see, kids as the future of things, but kids don't make decisions. They don't spend money. And I think that this is something that we talked about some this weekend with the people that we talked to at the Connor show, is you're seeing a point now where all these people that, may have been exposed to it when they were younger are now at a point where they can go out and do something and pursue that interest. And there's a lot of people that don't want to play video games all the time or go out to bars or party, and they're interested in going out and doing something they really connect with their hands. Yeah, that's my 2 cents on what we're seeing.
That's probably a good way of looking at it too. It's there are those people that are just going to sit around and play video games, but for those of us that doesn't appeal to, we turn to something, and I'm glad it's working with our hands for a lot of folks. But yeah, I've seen a major uptick in that type of, like I said, the big ones, blacksmithing, spoon carving, that type of thing. And it's a big explosion too. I mean, you see it start seeing things like the folk schools becoming pretty popular and busy. I mean, their classes are booked out for a long ways. And you see a bunch of people offering workshops on all sorts of different things and getting people to sign up. I mean, it's great seeing some of the revival of it.
Yeah. One of our big, educational programs that we put on is we partner with Western Kentucky University to put on a gunsmithing seminar. And it's focused on muzzleloader building, accoutrement building, and all that everything that goes into making the stuff around muzzleloaders. Yeah. And it is, by and large, by far one of the most interesting things that we do. And it really shows. I mean, there are people that come year after year and are interested in continuing to finish and continuing to work on, those traditional crafts. And it's really exciting, I think. I mean, it's really easy to get locked into the idea that it's dying and people aren't interested in it. But I'm glad you listened to the first episode where we talked a lot about this, where it's not dying, it's evolving. Yeah. It's just changing, and it's important to stay with it through the change, to make sure that this knowledge isn't lost, because there's a lot of people that know a lot about all of this, and we don't want to lose it through this shift.
And that's something I've had a hard time with too, is you get some people on and you're like, okay, I don't know, you have a particular craft you've developed. You're easy to talk to. I know exactly what I'm going to talk with you about. And then you get some people on and you're like, you are involved in so many things. I don't even know where to focus on or where to start with, or they're all cool. Yeah. So yeah,
it's like, where do you go with it?
It's difficult sometimes, but I love seeing some of the educational stuff come out too. And it sounds like you guys have an event. I don't know how some of your living history events and whatnot you go to, how much of that is an educational, teach people how to do things. But I know a lot of the in the primitive skills community, primitive technology, they have what they call gatherings. There's a dozen or something across the country every year. Things like Rabbit Stick, Winter Count, the Firefly Gathering, things like that, Between the Rivers, where I really like the format of them, because it's all about teaching skills or knowledge. So you go in and it's $350 for the week or something like that to get into it. But then it's basically a get together of instructors, and you go around and they'll be like, today I'm teaching whatever. And they go around and everyone, they create a schedule of what they're teaching, what days and whatnot. And then you just go around to whichever classes you feel like taking, whether that be felting or blacksmithing or flint napping or, whatever. You just hit the classes that you're interested in. You can learn a lot in those weeks, or in that week, or even if you just drop by for a day or two and whatever, you can really learn a lot. And I like that format where it's not necessarily that you're signing up for a specific workshop, but that you just you go and it's a get together of instructors, and then you just pick which instructor you want to go learn from for that day.
Yeah. That's really interesting. That's very similar to how our gunsmithing seminar is set up. It's you have to pre-register for the classes that you'd like to take, but they're set up in I think 3, 6, and 9 day courses. So depending on your schedule and what you're interested in, there's different kind of levels of depth.
Yeah.
But this is really interesting because that's the kind of thing that we could very easily start hosting on our grounds. And it's something that's very interesting. I mean, we're a 501c3 nonprofit, and so the education side of it is really important to us. I mean, we hold national matches and keep national records, on the competitive shooting side. But the education is what allows us to do what we do in hosting kind of the more exciting looking stuff, at least on the outside.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting. I'm going to have to bring that up.
Yeah, if that's something you guys are interested in hosting, I mean, yeah, you could do something a similar format, and I'm sure people would love it. I mean, just the opportunity to get together and learn from craftsmen and people that really know what they're talking about.
Yeah,
it's a great opportunity. And I think,
as always, we have a special offer for anybody listening to the podcast. If you're not an NMLRA member, you can use the code podcast10 at NMLRA.org and get a discount. Get a 10% off your NMLRA membership for 1 year. That's if you're looking at the digital magazine or if you're looking at the physical magazine. It should work for both. We can't do this show without the members of the NMLRA. And just like with Muzzle Blast Magazine, we're just continuing that here with the podcast, trying to bring you as much as we can about muzzleloading, traditional craft, and living history. And your membership helps us do that. So thank you. We've got a busy month ahead here. I'm looking at the calendar, and we're at the end of February. So the first weekend of March, we'll be going out to the 24th Annual Honorable Company of Horners Horn Fair and covering that event with some film and hopefully some interviews here as we get things arranged. And then towards the end of March, we'll be at the Kalamazoo Living History Show, interviewing several of the craftsmen and vendors there about muzzleloading, living history, and we've got a couple of the military groups on the line, so it's going to be interesting to hear about them because they're definitely kind of blurring the line more from the competitive muzzleloading and living history side of things. So I'm excited to talk to those guys. And then the weekend after that, we're working double duty. We'll be going down to the York Shoot in Tennessee, where it's kind of a traditional slug the York is a traditional chunk gun match. So it's one of those kind of weird sects of muzzleloading that we're excited to show the public some that hasn't been publicized very much. And then we'll be going to, that same weekend, we'll be going to the Creedmoor 150, which is partially is hosted by the NMLRA. So we're excited to get down there and film those guys shooting their Creedmoors, their Sharps, and some Whitworths out to 1,000 yards. As always, check out NMLRA.org for up-to-date information. We've published a lot of interesting and neat updates on the blog, and be sure to follow us on Facebook at NMLRA and on Instagram as Muzzle Blasts to keep up to date. Thank you.